Hello, and welcome to today's episode of On the Rocks. I'm excited to welcome my friend Allison Coppel, an expert in ESG and how it relates to mining investments. For 20 plus years, Allison has integrated environmental, social, and governance, aka ESG, into complex operational investment decisions on 6 continents, ranging from M&A, project stage, to post-closure. Currently, Allison informs Newmont leadership on ESG risks in the capital investment portfolio, including regulatory and stakeholder issues, permitting and environmental challenges, ethics, human rights, labor relations, and decarbonization. Previously, Allison held site, regional, and global social and environmental performance responsibilities at BHP, Newmont, Anglo American, Teck, and Antamina, spending most of her career in Latin America, Europe, and Africa. Prior to mining, she consulted with the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation, and the NGO CARE. She holds a bachelor's in international studies from Emory, a master's in developmental economics from the University of Nice in France, and an MBA from Stanford. All right, pour a glass of something fun to drink, and let's dive in. Well, Allison, thank you so much for joining me on the rocks today. I'm really excited to have you here. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm good. How are you? Nice to see you, Emily.
Same. I wish we were having a drink together in person, but this
Oh,
is
so
this
do
is
I. So do I.
So what are you drinking today?
Well, it's a cold day here in Denver, which creates the perfect conditions to my new pandemic era discovery, cognac. So this is called a
Um,
tesseron. And as you may or may not know, if it's called cognac, it has to be from the cognac region of France. Otherwise, it's a brandy. And Tesserand's like a mid-price for the cognac, so it's a nice finish. It gives a nice finish to your day, start of your evening, a lot of coziness, and yeah, it's good all the
a
time.
great transition drink. End of the day into the beginning of the evening.
Absolutely. So cheers to you.
Cheers. And I will be drinking, thanks to Jess Scanlon, our head of new media. I'm having some bourbon cream liqueur in a coffee for my end of the day push through from Orphan. It's the Orphan Girl liqueur from Headframe Spirits. So you gotta love a mining themed bourbon.
I do.
So if you like Bailey's, essentially, if you like Bailey's or something like that, or Kahlua, then you should definitely check out Orphan Girl. So that's what I'll be drinking.
Okay, that sounds good.
Well, I am really excited about today because we are going to be talking ESG and ESG 101 in particular. And even for folks who aren't in the mining industry and are just looking at the investing world in general, like ESG as a term and as a kind of focus point for the investor community is like everywhere right now, right? I mean, whether they love it or hate it, everybody's talking about it. So, could you kick us off with kind of an ESG basic? What is ESG?
Yeah. And what a great question. First, a disclaimer, this whole podcast, I'm talking as myself and someone who, thanks for the introduction, has worked for a number of years in this space, not as any company rep. So ESG, environmental, first it stands for environmental social governance. And I am going to define it for the mining industry because it can be defined differently in different industries. But if you are listening from another industry, think about how what I'm going to say reflects on the work that you do. So
Mhm.
for the mining industry, it's the current catch-all phrase that mainly investors use to describe anything that is not directly related to money or getting rocks and taking the metal off the rocks and selling it. So let's break it down. E, this honestly is usually the easiest one. It's the physical environment. For mining, this includes water, climate, air, waste, cyanide, biodiversity. And while tailings and mine closure are interdisciplinary, they're often thought of under the E.
Mm.
S is all things social. Now, most people think that it's just communities, especially when we think of a mine site and the people who live around the mine site. But it's all things people. It's also where we talk about our safety metrics,
Mm.
health, sometimes, if relevant, labor relations, anything supplier related, training of your workforce. We talk about the broad concept of human rights. Here we talk about diversity and inclusion, which often refers to as a workforce within the workforce. And
Yeah.
then the less understood, I think, is the G for governance. And I think of this category as how trustworthy is this company? How many checks
Mm.
and balances are there? When we're reading reports or looking at analyses, these often include metrics on legal compliance, especially in the US, political contributions, a lot on the board of directors. How often do they meet?
Mhm.
How many of the directors are independent? And here's also where we talk about ethics or ethics violations.
Mm.
And one more general note that sustainability is a term often used interchangeably, but sustainability usually just refers to environment and community issues. And these are a subset of the wider ESG basket. So when you hear, within your company or you're reading a report or listening to someone speak and that they're using these terms interchangeably, think about this conversation right here. How well do they really understand this definition of ESG? And are they using the terminology correctly?
And I wonder, to clarify, Allison, one of the things I oftentimes hear from people when they're talking about the G is there's a bit of a misunderstanding that it's about the government of the community or the country that the project's in. And is that part of governance, like the kind of risk level of the jurisdiction or the relationship with the local regulator or national government, or is that totally separate from ESG?
No, well, it's part honestly, it's part of the S, and it's a part about
Right,
how well do you understand the social context around your investment. Now, it does
right.
come a little bit into play under the G in when we talk about ethics. For
Mhm,
example, are you transparent? Are you transparent about payments to government officials? Are you
mm.
transparent about your taxes? Are you transparent about your political contributions? That's where it might intersect there. But the governance box is really about how accountable is this company.
Right, not how is the jurisdiction governed. That's what I think
Right.
one of the big things, that just to put a point on it for folks, that,
Yeah.
country risk level or license to operate at a government level as well as a social level is in the S, not in the G,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, of course, you talked about how you're framing this in the context of a mining company, but, like, why is ESG so important to the mining industry?
In short, it's the key piece to understanding if the plans to mine the rocks, process the metal, and sell the product are accurate.
Mm,
ESG describes the degree of uncertainty and enables the company to manage and minimize that uncertainty. As well as it's not just about risk mitigation, it's also about
mhm,
enabling value creation opportunities. Let me go into a little bit of detail here. So, when I think of ESG, it just makes sense. Protecting and where possible, enhancing the environment, ensuring safety for workers and good relationships inside and outside the company, for example, with government officials or community stakeholders, respecting human rights, creating a
mhm.
business where people and communities grow and are happy to do so, being transparent about how the company is run and following the law. These are basic expectations of society, especially when talking about an investment. And this is what I love about mining. We know these investments are long term and they're going to be there for 10, 20, 100 years. Yet for years, and sometimes today, a number of these concepts have been ignored, misunderstood, and thought of. Sometimes I literally see them as a mere asterisk to the real
Mm.
plans and not core components of the investment decision.
Yeah, and I wonder if I think there are obviously some benefits and negatives about the increased focus on ESG. And I know you'll probably get into this in some of our later topics, but I think one thing I've heard articulated is when you silo ESG off of the rest of the planning and it's no longer fully integrated in the assessment, the planning, and the execution, it makes it turn into that little asterisk as opposed to having it fully integrated in everything that you're doing from the very beginning.
Exactly. So, it's this multifaceted catch-all nebulous buzz term.
Mhm.
And what I've spent my career doing is attempting to translate the nebulous into the concrete.
Right.
So it's not an asterisk or one-line description of, okay, we want to develop this project or this expansion, but asterisks, there are ESG risks, kind of like what you were talking about, that off to the side, we'll have to deal with this basket, but let's get on with the real work.
Mhm.
But we have to create an integrated way of operating, of decision making, because these investment decisions, they can happen throughout the mine life. They can happen, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners and who's listening to this are involved in the early exploration space, either as explorers or investors. The same for each stage of project development, during operations expansions or upgrades, even enclosure. And they can be from the investor, an operating company, maybe an merger and acquisition target. So what I'm about to say, it may differ depending on these factors, but I hope the listeners, you think about this and then you apply it to the space that you're in and the timing that you're in. Because in short, when I hear as well this, I know I'm about to open up a door to discussion that we can go into later, but I'm just going to use it as an example. This door to deciding if you're for or against ESG. Should we talk about ESG? Well, just stop. The key is those aren't the right questions, because the key is to disaggregate ESG, define what within this basket is material to the investment, and then
Mhm.
integrate it as it makes sense.
Right.
Okay, I'm gonna take it through a bit of an example here. So, say you're an investor or an operating company, and you want to determine, this is my day to day, honestly. For now, it's you want to determine if you should fund the next stage of mining. Does this
Mhm.
project make sense? Is there a business case for this project? So, the first thing before you decide, should I apply ESG as this concept or not, or should I apply this asterisk or not? Let's take out the terminology. Just take the time to determine what's material, what could impact the
Mm.
cost or schedule of this project, because not every topic is relevant to every project. For example, is the project in a populated or unpopulated area? Is it in an environmentally sensitive area or not? And you were talking about before, the understanding of the environment, the government, the community context in which it operates. Is it a jurisdiction with a clear permitting framework or not?
Right.
So, implicit in my question is the key question: what could impact the cost or schedule of this project? Is the first action understand the operating context. For example, understanding how the government works, the physical environment, the community demographics, its history, its culture, its experience already with you, with mining. How does it operate? Its economy, the legal and regulatory framework, as we were talking about. I've seen throughout my career, unfortunately, so many projects where the project team, and especially when if it's an early stage project, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit, I think, is often it's the non ESG specialists are part of that
Right.
team. So the project team thinks that they understand because, oh, yeah, I live here. I understand this community. I know so and so and so and so. I live in this country. I'm in this environment literally. So I understand if it's dry, it's wet, it has frogs, no frogs, whatnot. But they haven't done the structured work to truly
Mhm.
understand. Because actually, here we go. Each of these ESG areas, whether it's biodiversity or community relations or understanding the permitting, closure costs, tailings, water, the concept of human rights and how it applies here, or something else, each of these is a professional discipline. But
Right.
often too often, as we were just saying, in these earlier project phases, the focus is so much on keeping the costs down to prove the
Right.
business case that these professionals who cost too much and are a luxury, sorry, these are just might be things I might have heard in
Right.
conversations and
Yeah.
meetings. These professionals are not incorporated until later, which is ironic to me from what I said at the beginning on why ESG is important because it's the key piece to understanding if the plans to mine the rocks, process the metal, and sell the product, i.e., if you have a business case, it's the key piece to understand if that's accurate because it
Right.
describes the degree of uncertainty and enables the company to manage and minimize that uncertainty. And it
But it helps
actually
you
makes a lot.
identify all costs too, right? I mean, when you go through that process, you're going to discover costs or things that need to be done that you probably wouldn't have anticipated if you hadn't gone through that really, really early, essentially level of due diligence in terms of your cost and your planning.
Exactly, and not only all the costs, where I have
Mhm.
spent a large part of my career is understanding how that builds into the economic model, but it's also you may miss opportunities to unlock value creation.
Mhm.
Which, like we were saying before, often isn't think about. But back to the cost, because that is the easier to articulate and is the most material. How do you know if there's a business case if you haven't adequately understood the environment and communities and other potentially material ESG issues?
Yeah.
Some of these actually cost money. It might cost money to mitigate downstream water impacts. It might cost money to mitigate wetlands. And what I always say in earlier stage conversations is that's great. There's metal in the ground, there's reserves and resources, and we understand it. It is only economic if we get it out of the ground. Yet when I
Mhm.
see economic models, especially simpler economic models, yeah, we tack on this mining cost and processing costs, and then a big bucket that's around general administration, G&A costs. And then what's the size of the prize? And is
Yeah.
this prize big enough to then worry about these ESG things? And it might not be as relevant in all jurisdictions. But if you already know it's a risky jurisdiction, because of the environment, because of the community issues, particularly those are the ones that are easier to assign this price tag for in this
Mm.
sense. You can actually build that in to your economic model to determine if it's worth it to get these reserves and resources out of the ground. So, anyway, I'm going to stop there for a second because I could go on around exactly how you do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder if, and again, this is of course just from your personal experience, but I've heard two different things on the ESG side. One is that it's too expensive, so we can't do it that early in the process because we haven't raised the money to do all these other things, and we need to put the money in the ground, right? Or into finding the resource. The other thing I hear when people are just having a drink at the bar is like, once there's a level of disclosure that once you understand all of these complexities, you have to kind of be really upfront about them. So if you haven't done the work yet, then are you not liable for whatever might come up if you do it? And I think that's the a big difference when I talk to folks about how do you look at a good company to invest in or partner with versus one who's maybe not a great partner or investment target, right? Because nobody's going to have all the answers from the very beginning, but you want to look for a company that's doing that diligence, doing that process as early as possible, because then you're going to know as early as possible kind of how the company is approaching the investment and the problem. And if you don't see companies doing that, that might be something that you want to really take note of if you care about ESG issues, which, as you're saying, everybody should because they lead to a better run and more efficient and ultimately more profitable project.
Exactly. A couple things in what you just said. Part of what you just said reminds me of a debate that when I was an on the ground community relations professional, social performance professional, I would often get into discussions with project directors. We're moving this project through, and I'm saying, okay, let's hear feedback from the communities. Let's understand what their concerns are. Let's explain what we know so far, what we don't know, how we're going to know what we don't know, and just be transparent about what we're doing. No, you can't tell them that. We don't have a project. We don't know what to tell them. So it's better just not to raise expectations and tell anybody. So I know I'm bringing
Mm,
it down to the site level of what you're saying, but it extrapolates a bit to what you're saying is, if I don't tell them, they won't find out, and therefore they won't expect anything. And time again, we have proved on the macro level and the micro level that it's the opposite that's true, that people
mm,
value transparency. People trust when you are transparent and consistently transparent. Obviously, if you haven't been transparent and then you drop this big dose of transparency and it's negative, yeah, you might feel a reaction to that and it might not be a good one. But if you're consistently transparent and you show up to your broader audiences, such as your investors and your governments, to employees and to your smaller audiences, the local communities, and you are consistent to say, like I was saying, what you know. Look, I know I'm a company. I know these are my values. I know these are my employees. This is what we want to do. What you don't know, but I don't know how many jobs I'm going to create. I don't know yet the potential environmental impact. I don't know, how big this mine is going to be. But how I plan to know what I don't know, we're going to do these studies. It's going to take many years. We're going to do this. And then the key question to ask at the larger level or the more micro level, and how do you want to be engaged? How do you want to
mm,
listen to information? Do you just want a quarterly update? Do you just want a yearly communication? Do you just want to hear when something's going wrong? If not, you're just going to assume it's going right and
yeah,
structure those relationships that way. But if you're just not even going to ask the question yourself because you're afraid of the answer, which is a little bit implicit in what your question is,
yeah,
and then because then you don't have to tell people because you don't know, that's
right,
when I really start to think about your governance, you know,
right,
and your metrics probably around ethics and probably
yeah,
around non-compliances are
mhm,
probably gonna start to increase. No, I don't know the scientific data, but I assume those are correlated. Um, but also here's a big secret because you started off saying, "Oh, it's too expensive. I don't want all these, programs." I think
I don't want all this warm, fuzzy stuff, adding fluff to the
well,
budget, right?
exactly. We need to prove there's a business case. So here's a secret. It doesn't cost all that much more, and we're gonna discuss what it does cost to do things right. When I talk to people, wider in the wider mining industry, and I say, "What comes to mind when you think about ESG?" Honestly, they think about community issues, and what costs
Mhm,
ESG. "Oh, I'm gonna have to do a lot of ribbon cuttings," these big splashy projects, we can't afford that. Or, some sort of, really high tech technology that we have to introduce now to decarbonize or, do something radically different. And I don't have money for that. Okay. Guess
yeah,
what? That's not what it takes, especially at an earlier stage. It takes having the right people. So that's where your costs may increase in the beginning because good professionals don't come cheap, as your engineer shouldn't come cheap. Are you gonna skimp
right,
out on your geologists? Are you gonna skimp out on your CFO? Or what about your CEO? Well, your if it's an environmentally sensitive area, if it's an area with a population around your site, you want those top level professionals as well, right there to help
mhm,
you understand the geology and the context in which you are operating to together come to find if you should be investing more money. That's what drives me nuts
Right.
is under thinking that you have to do these big splashy ribbon cutting. Actually, that might hurt you if you start off your relationship like that. It's kind of like I don't know if anyone else is having parenting challenges as such is, when you're little, it's like, "I'll give you a little piece of candy if, you do this for me." Okay, well, those candies sometimes get bigger and bigger, and then your kid might only wanna do stuff if you're gonna give them candy. So if
I would say my only exception to that rule would be potty training,
it's
'cause, like, M&Ms M&M's is bribery, it worked for me, just putting that out there in the world, and, like, that one was worth
actually,
it.
that's the
Just give
example
it
I'm thinking of because maybe my oldest will like me telling this story, but,
different podcast.
there might have been the case where things only happened if there were M&Ms involved.
Yeah, if you get candy. I hear
So,
ya. Yeah.
but anyway, but so if you're only going out and the first time you say hello, a new friend comes on the block and, they're not just coming out with little homemade cookies, but they're giving you a new car. Hi, I'm your next door neighbor. Here's a new car. Let me cut the ribbon. Are you going to
Yeah.
be best friends or is it going to be an awkward relationship? Anyway, what I'm saying is it doesn't have to be expensive. It's designing your project right from the get-go because your thought that it only is gonna cost you a geologist and maybe 2 other professionals to get this off the ground
Mhm.
in an area where there are material ESG risks, that in itself is flawed. So it was never supposed to cost, say, 100. It was always supposed to cost, say, maybe 120.
Right. Yeah, it was never that cheap to begin with.
Exactly.
You just didn't have the information in there, and I think that's where I know in some communities I've worked in, especially in the early stages with an exploration team, those early communications from the small team that's doing that first kind of field work and exposure to the community are so critical because they really create kind of the initial expectation with the community, right? And that's where I think it's so important that in a company, your whole team be educated and prepared on how to talk about the project and the potential value and how long it takes because I think we in the industry underestimate or maybe overestimate how much communities understand about our industry and how things are done and how long they take and the level of uncertainty, right? So to your point, if you show up and you're the geo and you're like, "Oh my gosh, I think we just found the next big one," right? I mean, this is going to be amazing. And then there turn out to have all kinds of technical complexities and regulatory complexities and environmental issues, right? It's that first introduction oftentimes that can either really positively set the tone or create unreasonable expectations or disappointment down the line, right?
Absolutely, and just to go a bit further on this example, what I've trained a lot of teams, exploration teams in particular, and teams in other stages, and their first question to me is, "What do I tell them?" And as we were
Mhm.
talking earlier, actually the key is, "What did you hear?" Is we're
Yeah.
building your first key step is to build the relationship, and when you think you're
Mhm.
building any relationship, it's about trust. And a key
Mhm.
component of that trust is, do I feel that you care about me, that you've heard me, that you can empathize with me? And
Mhm.
so what I often train are exercises about listening. Is it's
Mm.
not about you in terms of telling them things that we don't know. And then once
Yeah.
you enter in this space where I hear you, you hear me, we may not agree, then, you're in a phrase to hear maybe unsettling or uncertain news or information. But if we show up
Mhm.
and we show up like we have all the answers, and especially to your point, it's blown up and the key messages are that, we're going to save your community through this one discovery and you're not even hearing me, just think about
Mhm.
where your relationship is set.
Yeah, and I think that's where in some of the especially the international communities I've worked in that were in more emerging markets, companies also tend to come in with their under or that what they perceive to be the needs of the community. So when they do talk about what kind of investment should be made in the community, there is this impulse to think that you understand what those communities need rather than asking the communities what really is important to you and how would you like that done, right? Which can make all the difference. That's how well-intentioned people can end up putting a lot of money into school buildings that are unused or parks that are unused or wells that don't work, right? All these things that if it was more of a listening approach in that initial engagement, they could have had a much better impact from their investment and the time they put in.
Absolutely. And if I'm in a junior mining company, I'm just starting a project and I want to do the right thing and I don't know where to start. The first step is
Mhm.
understanding and making sure, that these are disciplines, as we talked about before. Understanding what this natural environment is, that's a discipline. You have to study the soil and the flora and fauna and air and the other pieces of that natural environment. You have to understand the communities, and that's its own discipline. So the first part is a huge effort in understanding. And as you go out yourself and you build relationships, it's also listening. But then after that, you need to take a step where after you gather some of this initial information and you determine, okay, what are the material ESG items here? And then understand how each one can impact your project cost and schedule. And you can think about that in your immediate term, to get to that next stage of funding or that next decision point. You can think of it in a longer frame of mind, ideally both, and not just thinking very short term, what will get me to that next permit or that next ability to move forward. And then here's the key part when I was talking about before that this doesn't necessarily have to cost more money, but it's a different
Mhm.
way of doing your work. You have to physically build this into your economic evaluation. You have to get another line or two or three in the Excel spreadsheet. And that sounds very
Mhm.
mechanical. It's in my world, I think it's pretty revolutionary. If it's
Yeah.
not just mining cost line, processing cost line, and then this general other bucket, spell out the material factors of that other bucket. And if they are ESG related, spell those out because that will really help you very early on. Because if it's huge, if you go, oh, there's all these wetlands. Oh, what do I do with that? Oh, there's these other sensitive issues. Oh, there's very little water here, and there's all these communities here, and they're probably going to want me to make sure that they're taken care of. These are tangible things that cost
Right.
money. And a lot of times, as we talked about before, those tangible things are
Right.
asterisks until you're maybe the day you're about to build or you're already halfway through building and a government regulator or a community or an NGO, someone raises their hand and says, oh, wait a second, what are you
What
doing
about this?
about this? I guarantee you that's 10 times more expensive or significantly more expensive than if you thought about it early on. You put all the
Mhm.
brain power, I would hope that the CEO sees this economic model and says, why did you put 100 million under these environmental costs? What is that? Well, I would hope to get the
Right.
airtime of the CEO on an environmental cost. I would hope to get the
Right.
airtime of the CEO and the board on a social cost. Or, I will say in an economic model, it is much harder. I haven't personally figured it out yet how to model that G of
Mm.
governance at this micro project level.
Yeah.
But if you think about this as a framework to get to the concrete, even if you are a macro level, you're an investor and you're trying to compare companies, you can start to think about how do I concretely put this into my model? It's a helpful framework to help you thinking about this with just as much attention as you're thinking about the geology or the reserves and resource numbers. And I lay these out in steps, but it's
Mhm.
iterative because you're going to find out just as you do in the technical space, just as you find out more certainty and confidence in your resource model. Just as you figure out technical challenges, technical being, directly mining related or processing related challenges, you update your model. Well, that's exactly what you should be doing in this ESG space. Because as we talked about before, if you're in this project and you've already sunk money in, let's say going in, and then you decide to ignore, as your earlier comment, I'm just not going to even really find out, like asterisks, there could be these downstream issues or this sensitive, maybe you have to do this, I don't know, biodiversity offset because
All this
that's
stuff.
what I've kind of heard that there's a lot of pressure to not just rehabilitate, but to create a more positive natural environment after I'm gone or during
Mm,
my operation. I'm just going to ignore that. Well, there is going to be a day of reckoning, whatever
right.
that day of reckoning looks like in terms of your investors starting to care because they're under pressure or because they genuinely care or they realize that these are material issues to your ability and your certainty to make the money that you're saying that you are. Or, as we see very concretely in a lot of countries, community, might protest or your permits might be blocked or under a deluge in more stable jurisdictions with more robust governments and regulatory systems. Maybe we don't see the protesters in the streets, but you may get a
Mhm.
thousand comments on your permits that are very well
Right.
articulated, and you have to go through that. At the end of the day, the results the same. Your project stopped for a year or two or more. Um, Anyway, say you get to your day of reckoning and then you go, "Oh, we've already sunk now, say, $100 million in this investment. We already have these very sophisticated mine plans done by these very smart engineers. We already know we're gonna put the tailings facility over here and the waste rocks over there." You mean that was on, uh, you know, I don't know,
Land we
a
access anymore?
land? How would I feel,
Right.
honestly, if a tailings facility went on my church? Like
Right.
you start making this about your life as well. It's like, of course, I don't want a tailings facility there.
Right.
Yeah, that's 10 feet away from a school,
Right.
maybe
Duh.
that's not a good idea. Would you want your children there? And
Right.
and you go back and you say, "Well, but I'm gonna have to redesign this." I'm gonna
Mhm.
have to hire all these very expensive engineers again. I'm gonna have to put this waste rock over here. Well, wouldn't
Yeah.
it have been a lot cheaper? I was in a situation once. I was in, Chile. I can say that because 'cause I've worked for a number of companies in Chile over my years. I was in Northern Chile, and it was actually one of these debates, whereas we can't go out and consult, engage with the community. What are we gonna tell them? And I said, "Well, we're gonna just introduce ourselves and ask them." And so this local mayor
Right.
of this community in Northern Chile tells me, "Well, do you have your paleontologist on board?" My what? You're just stumbling because it's new information. Well, this is a real hot spot for dinosaur remains, and,
Oh,
I would assume that you have your paleontologist already on board because there's only so many in Chile, and you gotta get them lined up, and it can be a real critical path for your project. This local mayor that was highly dismissed, I would say, by a few colleagues as
mhm.
someone who could add value to
Yeah.
our project. Well, she was telling me some really valuable information right there because people know their land. People have
Right.
value. People understand their community and how the natural environment operates and what's important to them. So she told me what was important to them. For them, it's so obvious. There's all these dinosaur remains. Thank
Right.
goodness, if we started to investigate, she was right, there was only so many paleontologists that could do this study, and
Yeah.
had to line that person up and understand the study, and then
Yeah.
talking to someone else, we found out where we wanted to put a tailings facility, there was an indigenous cemetery, and,
Wow.
imagine we did sink the, 50,000,000, 100,000,000 in that design to redo it. So,
Yeah.
anyways, it's not about being more expensive. It's about a different way of structuring your work and then putting it into your decision-making framework to make better decisions. Because at the end of the day, we all have the same objective. We wanna make money. We're in this business. We
Right.
want to make a sustainable investment that's economically sustainable. But why are we often rushing into this in a way that's not going to give us our results?
Yeah, because we all want the projects to move
Yes.
forward, right? Nobody nobody goes and
I have an MBA. I am not against
right.
making money. Money is a very good motivator in the world.
Yeah. Well, and kind of thinking about that, Allison, as you know, I ask all my guests, if you could change one thing about the industry, whether it's how we work or we think or what we're doing, what would you wave your magic wand and change overnight about the industry?
Honestly, Emily, I would accelerate the change that is happening. There
Mm,
is good practice in so many places at the early investment stage, at the exploration stage, at the good M&A due diligence. There's good operating practice. There are good expansions. There are good closure practices throughout the entire mine life and throughout your viewpoint within and your role within the mining industry.
mhm,
There are good examples that are becoming the norm, but there are too many gaps.
right.
Companies and investment firms need to continue to realize how much is in their control to
Mm,
understand and manage ESG in order to create the long-term value they want. So if there's one thing I could change overnight is more just an acceleration of the good change that is happening and to
yeah,
reduce or eliminate the gaps.
yeah, and the resistance, perhaps.
Get out of this
The-
debate of is ESG, not ESG. I'm like, that just already shows me that you don't get it. So
Or
understand
is it
first.
one thing, or is it three things? Is it CSR? Is it, yeah, yeah. Kind of move past the debate and get to doing the work.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I like that. Move past the
yeah.
debate and get to doing the work.
Well, on that note, thank you so much, Allison, for joining, and I hope you've enjoyed your cognac.
Ah,
And
I was
that's no
having so much
big.
fun. I forgot to drink it. Well, this was a fun talk. I enjoyed this. Thanks so much, Emily. I'm a big fan of your podcast. So thanks for including me.
Thanks.
And yeah,